How concerned are you about further escalation of the war from here?
I am concerned. First of all, thank you for having me. The Ukrainian use of drones really has come about. They've used them before. The Russians have used them as well for almost throughout the war. But the Ukrainians have really stepped up the use of drones since the Russians, abrogated the grain agreement and then began attacking, Ukrainian ports, grain supplies, grain, elevators, et cetera, really increasing their sort of efforts to destroy the Ukrainian economy. The Ukrainians have been incredibly inventive and innovative, and have now developed drones, that go at night. They can be submersible. They contain a fairly good size, payload. And it's those drones, as I understand it, that the Ukrainians are now using successfully, as you pointed out, against that naval ship and that oil carrier. But also keep in mind they are using drones to attack roads and infrastructure in Crimea, things that the Russians need to supply their troops, oil depots, ammunition dumps, and apparently they are being very successful, in what they are doing. But again, this is a result of what the Russians, have done since their invasion.
To your point, Ambassador, these are precision strikes, and the Ukrainians have been pretty smart in using them to swarm ships and do different things that haven't been thought about before. But all Russia has to do is turn around and send missiles into another apartment complex, and that's exactly what we saw over the course of the weekend. How effective is this strategy for Ukraine if Russia can simply turn around and target Ukrainian civilians?
Good question. That is what Putin, is just digging himself in deeper and deeper. He thought the Ukraine would fold, when they invaded 18 months ago. That has not happened. But instead of looking, to negotiate, and to really end this thing on a fair and just basis to respect, Ukraine's territorial integrity, they have just been increasing, in effect, terrorist activities, indiscriminate bombing of civilians, apartment buildings, hospitals. The Ukrainians have been much more, more targeted. So far, the Ukrainians have displayed an incredible sense of willpower, in standing up and not bending their knees, to the Russians. The Russians, I think what they have accomplished is to make Ukraine an enemy probably for the next 100 years. And I do not see the Ukrainian spirit being broken by what the Russians are doing.
Well, Ambassador, it also is a question of when Russia may break, if ever, because when you're thinking about things that are targeted, there's been targeted sanctions from the U.S., from allies, others that are meant to punish Russia. We're going to try to change behavior. We haven't seen that. Could Ukraine attacking commodity export routes for oil, for some of these grains, actually start to make enough of an economic dent, more so that may actually alter Russia's ability to continue fighting this war?
I would give two answers to the question. One, I think if the Russians are really hurting, I think they will find a way back into the grain agreement. They are hurting internationally. They had a summit meeting of African leaders recently. Only about 15 showed up. They decided to give free grain to some of their quote unquote allies in Africa. But they have suffered a huge blow to their prestige and standing internationally, because of what they're doing, on grain. The second thing I would say, though, on sanctions, I have watched sanctions over many, many years. And I think what has to be understood about sanctions is they are taking time. And the Russian economy, I believe, is being impacted in many, many, many ways that may not be obvious to people. But if you read very carefully what is going on in Russia, I think there is good reason to believe that the sanctions are having significant impact. Have they changed, Putin? Not yet. I think, unfortunately, the only thing that's going to change Putin's behavior right now is a solid defeat, on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what the Ukrainians are trying to do with their counteroffensive, right now, to break through the Russian defensive positions in the south of Ukraine.
What do you make of this peace plan, Ambassador, pitched over the weekend by Ukraine to more than 40 countries in Saudi Arabia? Because President Zelensky has very little to show for this exercise. Should the U.S. and allies be doing more to amplify what is apparently a 10-point plan here by President Zelensky, or is this just too early to be having this conversation?
I think it's a bit early. I'm very happy that the Ukrainians are playing on the international, diplomatic scene much more energetically. To have the Chinese there, the Saudis, and to have, as I understand it, all the countries there basically endorsing the principle of respect for borders and territorial integrity, which is, that's Ukraine's position, to a T. And the fact that, all of these countries were there, the Russians were not invited, and the Russians have been very antagonistic, towards this meeting. But do I think a diplomatic solution, is in the next, several months? I do not. The Ukrainians are demanding that the Russians, leave, that they get all of their territory back, including Crimea. The Russians are basically saying, we want you to recognize the loss of Crimea and at least the 4 provinces of Russia, which we have now declared of Ukraine, which are now part of Russia, according to their constitution. As a diplomat, the only way you're going to get, a solution is if the two sides are committed, to reaching some form of a compromise. That is not the case right now. And I think the fighting is going to go on for several more months until we see whether or not the Ukrainians can make a significant breakthrough in the south of Ukraine.
Well, I'd like to get your perspective as a diplomat, not just any diplomat, as the former U.S. ambassador to Belarus, about the reports in recent days that Russia may be preparing a false flag attack in that country. What do you make of those reports, and what would happen if Belarus is drawn more seriously into this conflict?
False flag attacks, if you recall, there were reports that the Russians were going to do that, in parts of Ukraine before they actually began their invasion. And thanks to the very assiduous decision on the part of President Biden, to use some very highly classified information, we really were able to publicize what the Russians were doing and in effect prevent them, from doing that. This kind of false flag attack is something that's very much in the KGB, handbook. My own sense is, the Prigozhin, the Wagner troops are in Belarus, and they've been moved, closer to the Polish border. My guess is that this is just part of, Lukashenko, trying to, stir up the pot a bit. I can't believe that the Russians would allow some type of an attack, into Poland, which would have automatically, trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So I don't dismiss the possibility of a false flag, event involving Lukashenko. But I kind of think that, that the possibilities of doing anything in Poland are not very high.